We just heard Hennepin County Prosecutor Mary Moriarty say that the question she will be focusing on in her homicide investigation of the killing of Alex Preddy is whether there was any reasonable justification for law enforcement to fire 10 shots at him. And joining us now to consider that question are Mark Claxton, director of the Black Law Enforcement Alliance and a retired NYPD detective. Also with us, Kirk Burkhalter, professor of law at New York Law School, where he is the director of the 21st Century Policing Project. He is also a retired NYPD detective. Mark Claxton, what do you see when you put all these videos together?
What I see are several violations of DOJ's own policies multiplied exponentially. And I think along with use of force policies DOJ has adopted, which is kind of the national standard, imminent threat of serious physical harm or death to yourself or others. There was a violation of also their de-escalation requirement, along with the affirmative duty to intervene, which deals specifically with intervening on your partner's misconduct or some conduct on the street there. You can directly intervene. You're required to directly intervene. I didn't see any intervention to attempt to de-escalate or to eliminate this threat that was obviously posed by the ICE or Border Patrol agents themselves. And then also affirmative duty to render aid. I didn't see, and I don't know if you have seen any video about this, but I haven't seen any rendering of aid immediately following the shooting. What I saw was some retreat by these quote unquote professional law enforcement individuals. So there are several different layers of policy violations along with the atrocity of this enforcement operation.
Kirk Burkhalter, what do you see in the videos?
What jumps out to me is the ramifications of a law enforcement officers who are not trained for the mission that they were asked to do. The tactics appear to be poor. This is a classic example of contagious fire. They are gassing themselves when they're deploying tear gas. And they are, as you mentioned in your opening, committing assaults. If law enforcement, if you put your hands on someone, you push them down, that may be necessary force for arrest. But if there's no arrest, then that's a crime. So for me, the majority of this leads back to, as far as the officers are concerned, these agents, not trained for this mission whatsoever. It's just taking a group of folks and throwing them out there and asking them to enforce the law. This is the result.
I'm so glad you mentioned the contagious fire phenomenon, because that was a point that I saw and wanted to include in our analysis. And Mark, that's the phenomenon. We've seen it for as long as we've been studying these cases, that one officer in a group fires and that creates a contagion effect with someone else firing, thinking, not knowing where the threat was coming from necessarily. There's a lot of reasons for it, but that multiple shot situation from multiple shooters is always a fascinating thing to see, especially when most of the officers who have exactly the same opportunity see no reason to fire their weapons.
Yeah, and that's important to point out. And what it shows is that a professional law enforcement person understands quite clearly that each individual officer or agent is responsible for each trigger pull or discharge of that weapon. They have to make individual assessments about what is an imminent threat of serious physical harm or death to themselves. And they have to make those decisions, not part of groupthink, because that's when you get into these contagious situations, but they have to respond based on their own individual assessments, not necessarily influenced by their partners. So you have that situation. And you also have this other element of officer-created jeopardy that oftentimes comes into play in these situations, where it is the law enforcement professional who is initiating the actions that lead to a situation where there is a fatal confrontation. And then they come back to say, well, we were put in a position where there was an imminent threat to ourselves.
Yeah, the first shooting of this kind that I ever studied, a shooting in Boston in 1975, was one officer started firing because the other officer started firing for exactly that reason. Kirk, as a lawyer, what do you see in terms of this case as a homicide investigation? A homicide is a legally neutral word. It just means a human being killed a human being, sometimes justified, sometimes not. But what do you see here as a lawyer in this case?
Well, it will turn on reasonableness. The agents involved, whether they can articulate that their use of force was reasonable based on their experiences in the light of all circumstances. I will tell you, this is quite a hill for them to climb. We have video of the gun being removed prior to the shots were being fired. Did the officer that removed the weapon call out to the other officers that he had removed the weapon? This man was on the ground and multiple officers were trying to subdue him. Wasn't necessary to shoot him. We heard these reports that he brandished a weapon, never brandished a weapon. It's going to be difficult, but that reasonableness, right? That's what law enforcement officers must articulate when explaining the use of force in the face of criminal charges.
Kirk Burkhalter and Mark Claxton, thank you both very much for joining us tonight.